Okay, so today Liz will be sharing hers, and so you're going to take whatever time you need, and then you guys remember that the second half of the class is discussion. So I don't know if you have some question prompters or not, but be thinking about contributions. Okay, you're on, Liz.
Okay, so I chose the case study, Should Mrs. Young Submit? And it's basically a story of this character, Mrs. Young, whose family owned a shop that supports ancestor worship. So it has like incense and other things necessary for their ancestor worship. And she was heavily involved in running this business up until the point where she got saved. She got sick, and then she, through the ministry of the local church, she was saved through that. When she came back home, she was no longer comfortable working the shop anymore and participating in their family practices. And she was able to compromise with her husband, where she was able to take care of the kids while he ran the shop. Unfortunately, he suffered a stroke, which left him paralyzed, leaving him unable to take care of the shop. And that left him unable to take care of the shop, and he, obviously not wanting to give up the family business, wanted his wife to manage it. But because she was saved, she did not feel comfortable running the shop. And she refused, and she offered a couple of other solutions, and none of which her husband particularly liked. And she's now torn about whether or not she should run the shop for him. Yeah, another issue brought up was the fact that now that her husband was paralyzed, he wanted their son to lead the ritualistic practices of worshiping their ancestors. And again, Mrs. Young, their children had been going to the church, and Mrs. Young wanted them to be saved, obviously. And she was not comfortable with the idea that her son would be taking over this practice and learning how to perform these practices, which are obviously sinful. So the main characters are obviously Mrs. Young and her husband. Mrs. Young is torn between submitting to her husband, which is a biblical mandate, and standing up for her new beliefs. Obviously, idolatry is very strongly against, or the Bible is very strongly against idolatry. She does not believe that her family shop is biblically correct, but she knows that the Bible calls wives to submit. Mr. Young, on the other hand, has been running this business for his whole life. His worship practices are very important to him, and all of a sudden his wife is telling him that it's wrong and he needs to be saved. Now he has lost the ability to walk and live life normally, and she refuses to help him. She refuses to do what the wife is supposed to do. The issues here is a choice between the biblical principle of submission and the biblical principle of not worshiping idols or supporting those sinful practices, both of which are addressed very strongly in the Bible. Mrs. Leong has the choice between defending her faith and refusing to submit to her husband. And the Bible clearly states that worshiping idols is a sin. Everyone knows the 10 Commandments. In Exodus 20, verse 3, it says, "You shall have no other gods before me." And while this passage was originally given in the law to the Israelites, we still have, it is reaffirmed in the New Testament. We have, in Mark, Jesus calls us to love God with all our heart, soul, and mind and strength. If we are worshiping idols, that love that we are to devote to God is taken away. And obviously, I'm not saying that Mrs. Young would be worshiping these idols with her by selling these things. She is not intentionally giving her heart to these things because she knows it's wrong, but she is supporting the practice of worshiping idols by working this shop, which obviously God says is no. In Acts 15, verse 20, after the Council of Jerusalem, the conclusion is that they don't have to. The Council of Jerusalem, as you should know, is a discussion about what the Gentiles are now required to do. The Jews were saying that they're required to obey the law completely, but the Gentiles didn't quite understand that and didn't understand the necessity of that. And the conclusion after that was that they don't have to obey the law, but they should avoid things contaminated by idols, which is very much like what Mrs. Young is doing in the shop. She's selling these things which support the ritualistic practices of this idol worship, of this idolatry. And then in Galatians 5, we see that idolatry is one of the deeds of the flesh. And all of these are reasons why Mrs. Young should not want to participate in the idol worship with her husband, or even in selling the things in her shop. She does not want to support that practice. The other option is simply to submit. Mrs. Young is being called to work in the shop and allow her son to perform the family rituals. The majority of the passages in the Bible that talk about the wife's relationship to her husband talks about submission. Ephesians 5, Colossians 3, 1 Peter 3, all of those passages command wives to submit to their husbands. Mrs. Young genuinely has a difficult decision to make. I personally believe, though, that she should simply submit to her husband and run the shop and allow her son to participate in these practices. 1 Peter 3, verses 1 and 2 specifically talks about the relationship between a saved wife and an unbelieving husband. It doesn't say anything about submitting to the husband when the husband is doing something good, it's wanting her to do something good. It simply says to submit. Their submission is so that they can win their husbands without saying a word. Does that mean Mrs. Young should never protest and never share the gospel with her husband? Not protest in like a naggy way, but like protest saying, I'm not comfortable doing this. No, I'm not saying she shouldn't express her opinions and explain her beliefs to her husband. But she should, and she can still share the gospel. But if he persists in asking her to do it, she should submit. MacArthur explains submission this way. Instead of nagging, criticizing, and preaching to her husband, a wife should simply set a godly example before him, showing him the power and beauty of the gospel through its effect on her own life. Humility, love, moral purity, kindness, and respect are the most powerful means a woman has for winning her husband to the Lord. 1 Peter 3 also continues and uses the example of Sarah and Abraham. When we look back in Genesis, we see a few situations where Abraham asked Sarah to sin, and she does it. For example, there are 2 times where they go and Abraham is like, hey, tell the king and the guys there that you're my sister. And she does. And this passage does not mention that. It simply says submit like Abraham or Sarah submitted to Abraham. And in all these passages, there's not a caveat saying that a wife should only submit when her husband asks her to do something that is right. Ephesians 5:22 and 23 says that wives should submit to their husbands as to the Lord. When God gives a command, we are not supposed to question it. Instead, we are simply to obey. This does not discount the failures that are inevitable in a human husband, but as wives, we are simply to submit. Nancy DeMoss Wolgemuth says that submission recognizes the fallibility of not just the husbands, but also the wives. We all sin. Nevertheless, God calls women to submit to their husbands. While I understand the difficulty of not feeling comfortable with what her husband is asking her to do, God ultimately calls wives to simply submit. Therefore, Mrs. Young should submit to what her husband is asking to do, hopefully that one day her humble heart and submissive attitude will direct her husband to God.
All right, so that's a juicy one. Good. Now, do you have questions that you want to ask specifically, or you just want to open it up for discussion? Okay, so let's chime in and so questions, comments, opinions, all of it is fair game. Okay, so let's analyze this.
What again was she selling? I don't know if
I don't think it was very specific in the article, just that it was, let's see. Oh, it sold incense sticks, containers, and candles for Chinese ancestor and temple worship.
Oh.
So it's all things that support their ancestor worship.
I was, when you brought up Sarah and Abraham and how, like, Sarah was commended for her her submission in Hebrews, you know. I've like heard this before that like she was commended for her submission to her husband. Sorry, I'm just looking it up. She was commended for her submission to her husband, but not for like the lying or for like, you know, like she did sin and taking part in like the lying and stuff like that. And so like we're obviously like we are to submit to our husband, but we're not to like we're under God first. And so like we like if our husband commands us to sin, we're not told to like obey him in that submission. Like we can like protest and not sin. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I'm not being very clear. But and I'm not saying like it's like directly sinful to sell these things because it's not like she's participating in idol worship, but I wonder if you could make the argument that she could not submit in this area because she feels convicted about participating or like enabling idol worship, if that makes sense.
And that is the main thing that I saw is a lot of women say, or a lot of people who talk about the submission say, come to submission, or like, I know what I'm trying to say, but I can't verbalize it.
Go ahead, Liz. This is part of it. Just struggle through it and say it as best you can.
Yeah, where it's what you said, where a woman isn't called to submit to the sin, and like you said, she isn't commended for submitting to these sins, or it's in the case of Abraham and Sarah. But at the same time, she is not rebuked for submitting to them. She's not rebuked for going along with it. So that's kind of an argument from omission, but she's neither commended nor rebuked for those actions. And I can understand this. Yes, we have a responsibility towards God, and we have a responsibility not to support or participate in idolatrous actions. But God has also called us to submit to our husbands. And so in cases like this, where it's a responsibility to not sin or to not submit to your husband, both a lose-lose situation, where you're sinning either by performing this action or you're sinning by not submitting to your husband. And yeah.
I get your point of view, but I would also like the same way, wives are called to submit to your husbands, and like your husbands are called to submit to the Lord, and like obviously we're under the Lord too. And so like it makes me think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as like we're also called to submit to civil government, but not when it defies the Lord. And so the same way that they were like obviously blessed and commended for not bowing to the gold statue, I think like they were commended for not submitting to civil government. So there obviously is time when you don't submit to the authorities that God has placed you under because you are under his authority first. So when those authorities are leading you to sin and like, I don't know if, you know, like if breaking your convictions, you know what I mean? Like if that's the same thing as like just blatantly sinning, you know, like if your husband tells you to lie to someone, like that's sin.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know if this could be considered sin or if it's just like you know, it's like one of her conviction, you know what I mean? But because she's not participating in the idol worship. But like, I do think that like Sarah was wrong for lying when Abraham told her to lie, even though she was submitting to him because he was telling her to sin. And just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were commended for not submitting to the civil government, Sarah shouldn't have submitted to her husband in that circumstance. So like if a husband tells a wife to sin, the wife shouldn't do the sinning, even if she isn't submitting to her husband. And that's is my understanding of scripture.
Yeah.
But I don't know if this is like considered a sin though. So this is a really complicated one.
Yeah. This is a really complicated one. And I didn't address that aspect of it.
Right.
Where it's where the Bible does clearly say that, I don't remember the passage, but there's a passage where it talks about where where if we violate our conscience, we are sinning. But there's also Christian liberty. But at the same time, we can't take that too far. And yeah.
Good. Others can chime in. Yeah, go ahead, Jay.
So I read an article that kind of addressed idol worship or practices and things like that, at least on the personal side of things, because when I read the article, I kind of separated it into her personal problems with her son and having to do idol worship, and then the business side of things and selling the incense sticks. But on like the personal side of things, I read an article by it was like by the University of like Pretoria that was like talking about different areas of the world that also deals with idol worship. And one of the interesting things that some Christians in Korea have been doing is instead of doing what they call veneration of ancestors with incense sticks and idol worship, instead they would have a kind of like a compromise and instead have an observance of ancestors, kind of like a memorial service for Christians, because obviously there are some Christians that are still like, well, I don't want to just forget about my ancestors. And so I feel like when I read the article, it seemed like the husband was a very loving husband, even though he was unsaved. And so I wonder if she could reach some sort of compromise with him in maybe having the church facilitate a memorial service for the ancestors rather than an idol worship sort of service at like one of the temples or at one of their shrines instead. Because at the end of the day, it would fulfill the condition that the son is, you know, performing the per se ritual of remembering his ancestors, but it wouldn't have the religious veneration or the idol part of it. Because it seems to me that the father is more worried about the duty being done rather than the actual like religious aspect of it, to be honest. I know that a lot of Asians in their culture, it's more of a cultural like social obligation than it is actually like they actually truly believe in it or something. It's more part of their daily life. So I wonder if they could reach some sort of compromise that way. But I'd say in the side of things when it comes to running the business and saying like, yes, I'm going to sell these incense sticks even though I'm a Christian, and like I do agree that the wife should submit to her husband. She should like obviously it's not even the issue doesn't even come from that as well. Just the fact that her husband is a paralytic now, and the incense business is literally one of the only ways of them having income for her family. So it definitely even jumps the line to the physical side of things of problems that could happen if she doesn't do it. But the problem I have is that in Luke 12, 52 through 53, it says, "For from now on, one house there will be 5 divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. There will be divided, father against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law." So when Jesus came and he gave his message of the gospel, he said, I'm not coming in peace. I'm not coming to bring about this great social harmony. I'm here to basically bring something that's going to break families up. It's going to cause problems, because the Jewish community was very much like a lot of Asian communities in the fact that there's a lot of social harmony, a lot of following of rituals and laws. And Jesus brought a gospel that kind of broke that kind of turned it on its head. And so it kind of caused the same exact issues. So Jesus is saying, the gospel that I'm giving you is not going to make it easy for you. It's not going to make it a good situation for you in terms of your loved ones, because it's very hard for them to come to the gospel at the same exact time as you. And so I'd say for her, in terms of running a business, she might have to change up the business. She might have to sell something else, something maybe related to the business that she's in, but not one for idol worship. She's going to have to get creative, because unfortunately, I don't think that, even though that she's trying to submit to her husband and she's trying to juggle financials and she's trying to make life easy or trying to make life possible for her family, at the end of the day, we're not called to just make family life easy. We're called to worship God with everything that we have. So I'd say she's probably going to have to sacrifice something, or she's going to probably have to give up something for her faith. But that's where I'd say she'd also probably go to the pastor for some help. I'm sure the pastor could brainstorm some ideas, maybe find ways for her to get hired from the church, or find ways for her to find other ways to keep her family supported. because the fact is her husband can't support her anymore because he's a paralytic. So she's got to be the Proverbs 31 woman, and she's got to run the business. She's got to make the money now. And so she's got to work really hard for that, which is unfortunate to have to say to somebody, tell them like, you just got to do it, you know, but that's the problem, is that she does. So yeah, that's what I have.
Who else?
My thoughts are very similar to Jade. I kind of passed over the article that you mentioned. It was kind of funny that we found the same article. But then I also talked to my friend Carrie. She is in South Korea, and she has a family on one side where they do that. And her mom and her are Christian, and her younger brother are. But it is, like, for her mom, it was very hard for her to kind of do that. She's in a very similar situation to this, but she had to choose, like, you have to choose a hard side. You have to choose to submit. You have to kind of submit, but you also, thinking of words, because it puts you in a very very hard place. But in the situation that my friend's Kiri's mom was in, is she chose God, and she made it very difficult for a few years, but her husband finally kind of was starting to get it. And in this situation, she's going to have to choose to either figure out what to do for her family, which is not something you want to say to somebody. But above all else, God will come first. And God will also figure out ways to help, and will give you ways that are helpful. I don't know if that makes sense.
Rachel or Will, a comment, opinion?
I have to agree with what Mackenzie just said. Since we're called to submit to our husbands, the wife is called to submit to her husband, but you see it even today, like people post in their social media bios, God, family, friends. You're supposed to submit to God first. And I would say also that Jade brought up the idea of the pastor in this situation. The wife needs to find a new way to support her family. I think the pastor can play a big role in helping the wife to find a new way to support her family, and if even the church, even that the pastor is the pastor over, could even help in this situation, like an offering could be taken up to support them for like a month or something like that before she can get back up on her feet to find a different way to support her family.
Good. Rachel?
I agree with them. They said a lot.
Yeah, Jade?
Just one quick detail. I noticed in the article that it said that she was illiterate. Am I right? And if she was illiterate, and that could have made finding a job hard. It was like this small, like one sentence thing that made me go like, Because to me, if she's illiterate, I think that could really quickly change if she goes to that church regularly. Because I don't know because Monday night at GRC, we had Dan Anderson talk about the fact that a lot of Christians in like those parts of the world and people in those parts of the world are like illiterate, like literally cannot read. And he talked about the importance of the church kind of being there to educate and like facilitate them, like getting an education, teaching them how to read, things like that. And I think that if the church were again to step in and just kind of like educate her, help her in getting like new skills and new ways to support the family, rather than like a 2,000-year-old like business, like, and actually be able to work in a more modern environment, then she might be able to find something more morally neutral than selling incense sticks. You know.
Can I interject a question? Given your position, do you believe that there is some point at which she would biblically have to refuse to submit to her husband. Let's take an extreme case. Her husband says, we need more money. You need to go out and become a prostitute to raise money for us. Her husband's commanding her to commit prostitution to raise money. Is there a line somewhere in your thinking?
I would say just submit.
Pardon?
I would just say submit. I have a rather extreme view of submission.
Okay.
So, yeah. Well, hopefully it wouldn't come to that. Yeah. I would say she would have to submit.
Okay. All right. So your view of submission, as I'm hearing it, is without limits. It is totally unconditional. Whatever the husband would tell her to do, she would have to do.
And obviously there is still a freedom in expressing your opinions and saying, I'm not comfortable doing that. And like humbly protesting something, and even attempting to come up with a compromise. But if the husband is set in what he is asking his wife to do, I would say that she has to submit.
Okay. I had a lady in a Sunday school class that I was teaching when I was back in seminary. And she held that view. She said, if my husband told me I had to go out and go to bed with men to raise money or whatever, I would have to submit to him, and the burden of guilt would rest upon the head of my home, which is my husband, and not myself. That was her position. When you look at sin entering the universe or entering the world through Adam and Eve, who's held responsible for sin entering the world? Why?
Who's the head?
Did Eve? I mean, she sinned first, technically. That's debated. Some would say that she would not have been the first to submit if Adam had been doing his job as a husband to begin with. But that's based on silence. There's nothing in the Bible that talks about that. Yeah. Okay. Do you guys realize that one of the reasons that this case study is a hot button here is because of the way that we view men and women in our society? You guys all know that we cannot base our position on culture. But at the same time, we have to be aware that the positions we come to are influenced by the way our culture views the roles of men and women in this case, given this discussion. There are cultures in this world that would read this and say, this is not a case study to talk about. There are cultures where the woman would submit without, it would be considered out of order for us to even be opening this up for discussion. Okay. I appreciate the fact that you're all, using scripture to I've heard scripture come from almost all of you who have discussed, who've given your opinions on this. All right, what else comes to your mind? We've still got about 15, 20 minutes as you're mulling this over. Other thoughts that come to your mind that might contribute to our discussion? Let me just generate discussion. How then do we deal with the passage that Jade quoted? Okay, that I've come to separate husbands from wives. And I'm assuming, refresh my memory, in that passage, he does make specific reference to husband and wife.
I didn't think so.
Let's take a look at it.
I don't think
They
he
will be
does.
divided, father against son, son against mother, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. So there is no specific mention of husband and wife.
But there is mention of authority and submission there, right? Father and son. So the concept of not submitting does come up. Go ahead.
I would say there's a different relationship between father and son versus husband and wife, where the father and the son is not a picture of Christ in the church, where, yes, children are called to obey their parents, but when they are adults, they are now called to honor their parents. Where there is a different relationship where the father, and obviously this is different because of our societal expectations, where some of this view is because of our view of raising children, but the point of the parents are to raise their children to be independent adults. And So obviously there is an independence and when a child is an adult, while they should honor and respect their parents' opinion, there's a point where they no longer have to submit to their parents as an adult. However, a wife, when she enters into that marital contract with her husband, she has now promised to submit to her husband until they or for as long as they're both alive. So
Okay, interesting observation. Children are being taught independence, they're being raised in order to become independent. So the submission of children to parents. Now, if we had this discussion in India, you might get a little different take on that, because in India, no matter how old you are, how if you're married and have children, the oldest living patriarch of the family is still considered to be authoritative, which is not without its problems when you come to the leaving and cleaving passage in Genesis 2. What do they do with that? That gets a little dicey. Okay, this is good. This is good. Let's keep talking. What else are you thinking about here? Yeah.
Because I had a passage in mind, but I couldn't find it. So I had that other one, but there's also like 2 chapters further on in Luke 14, 26, where he says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. And it talks about bearing his own cross, coming after him. If they can't do that, they're not his disciple. Then he talks about like counting the cost, basically like knowing what you're getting into when you become a Christian. So for me, that's like about loyalty. Not really like, oh, if you love me, you should just hate like your loved ones. But just the fact of priority, like how I loved Jacob and hated Esau. It's just a priority of like love, a priority of favor. And so it's like the priority of who you should love the most should obviously be Jesus or God of your family. So to me, it's like, so the question is submitting to your husband, even if that means committing an egregious sin to the point of murder, adultery, basically breaking the law or breaking commandments, is that in a way showing that love towards God because you're obeying him and submitting to your husband, but at the same time not showing faithfulness towards him by also breaking his commandments?
Okay, good question. Let's talk about it. Do you have a thought on it?
I would say that you phrased it in a way that I wanted to repeat, but I can't remember what you exactly said. Could you repeat it again?
So is showing loyalty towards God, being the highest amount of loyalty to God, is that shown through submitting to your husband, even if that means committing an egregious sin, which in fact is breaking that loyalty towards God?
I would say yes. It is. Yeah, we are. Yes, we are called to submit to our husbands under God. So yes, by submitting to our husbands, even if he is asking us to do something absolutely horrible, then we are submitting to God. Yeah.
Now, I'm just going to tighten the screws a little bit more just to make sure that you're firm in your position. Husband hates his wife. He wants to get rid of her. He's got another woman in mind. He wants her. So he tells his wife to go out and murder her neighbor in broad daylight, knowing she'll get caught by the police. She'll be put in jail forever. He divorced her for the other woman. If you're the wife, should you go out and shoot your neighbor in broad daylight?
That's an uncomfy question, but yes.
Now, understand too that we're treating this in the laboratory of a safe environment.
Yes.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that when you, and it sounds to me like you've done a lot of thinking on this, but I'm just trying to push this into a realm that really tests or tries to put to the test, the resolve of your position. Okay, the chances of that ever happening are probably very slim, but I'm using an extreme example to test the case.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Others want
Can you okay, so
to.
now you're into a league where you're disobeying God's commandments. So can you maybe because if you with the law, like God's law, if it with the obeying the authorities, obeying the government or whatever, but if it comes down to if your authorities want you to denounce your faith or kill somebody, that's when you disobey the law. Would you? So you're saying you wouldn't agree the same with a husband and wife, because if your husband's telling you to go murder someone, that's directly disobeying God's law of murder.
I will admit I had not thought of the government issue before. That is something I had not thought of, and I will have to go back and consider that some more.
Mm-hmm.
But because obviously with government, I would say there's a balance. So I guess in that way, I'm kind of contradicting myself.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that is not something a question I had thought of before.
Mm-hmm.
Liz, one of the things that should put you at ease here is that in many of these case studies, we're going to find that, and this is not just true of a husband-wife thing, but of other studies, we're going to find that there is not a solution that seems to answer all of the criteria, all of the factors that are tied in. For example, one question that I think we have to consider in this is, if you say that a woman should commit murder if her husband tells her to do it, then are you in essence saying that when she sins, her sin is not, the guilt of that sin is not applied to her, but it's applied to her husband through her, and therefore she comes away free? If you believe that the woman's sin in that case, in obedience to her husband, is not applied to her, that God does not impute that to her because she's married, okay, now you have another problem to deal with, which is individual accountability before God,
Right.
of the husband and the wife. If you believe that she is not guilty for murdering, then, that's, to be consistent with that position, I would think you would almost have to arrive at that place where you say, God does not hold her guilty, or God did not hold Eve guilty for what she did.
Yeah.
That sin is passed through, it's applied to her husband, she's exempt because of her relationship to her husband. That gets a little dicey too. It's tough.
It's a complicated topic.
It is, it really is, which is why we select these topics. Yeah, go ahead, Jade.
Sorry, I'm talking a lot, but I just have a question. So since she is the Christian in the relationship and it's the husband that's unsaved, I guess I have two questions. The first question is, does that mean because she's a Christian that she would have a higher accountability before God because she knows the scriptures and she knows what's right and wrong before God? And so does that kind of change the idea of how, even though that she's a wife and she's submitting, that sort of accountability goes towards the husband? Does that kind of change that because she is knowledgeable of what is right or wrong through the gospel?
Good question. Do everybody understand the question? Is accountability directly related to knowledge of a sin? Or
There are a lot of people who say that, and it's something that has crossed my mind, but I have not thought completely about it. But I've heard that expressed a lot. And even in the Bible, there's the passage where it says that even Sodom and Gomorrah will not be held, or will not be punished as much as you will, because you knew me and you, and yeah. So in this case, it's a little bit more complicated.
Yeah.
But that's an interesting question.
you all know that in the Old Testament sacrificial system, there was a specific offering required for sins of ignorance. If somebody sinned, even if they didn't realize they had done it, the offense against God still happened, and therefore an offering had to be made even though the person was unaware that it was wrong at the time. Yeah.
So what about in a situation like my best friend's mom and stepdad? He's a alcoholic, and like he's been to jail like now 6 times, I think, and like he's lost his license and still would drive, and then still would drink and drive and drink, and just it was, yeah, it's crazy. And like he would tell my friend's mom to like go to the store and buy beer for him or whatever, and so what would you say? Like, I would say that she shouldn't do that, that she should disobey him. Like, what would, I don't know, because I feel like that's like,
I would say she would have to submit.
yeah, I would say, I don't know, because he's obviously he's not a Christian, she's a Christian, but like, I would say, well, even especially if he drove, he doesn't have a license. I don't know. I mean, he's just got out of jail like a couple months ago, but I would say that like, even though, I don't know, I just feel like she shouldn't go and get alcohol or whatever.
I would say that's like a really similar situation because, and like, I mean, like, I guess it depends too on what you think of drinking, but either way, his intentions are probably to get drunk. So like, that's, like we know that getting drunk is a sin.
Mhm.
But, so yeah, like, I think it's like a similar situation. Like, she's not necessarily sinning, but like possibly enabling others to sin, Yeah, I'd say it's like the same thing, just hard.
Because then, like, when he's drunk, he's like gone and like literally they would hide the keys also for their vehicles, and they had like a $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 truck, all souped up and everything, and like they would hide the keys for all their vehicles, and at different times while he was drunk, he would somehow find the keys and like go drive the cars, and I think the van, that truck, and another car that they had, like he crashed like all 3 of them different times, like, and it was just like, oh my goodness.
Let me point out something that's been happening in this discussion, and I think you're catching it, but I don't know if you've really, there are two things going on when we talk about whether it's right or wrong. One is theological. What does the Bible teach about this? The other is practical. What are the perceived consequences? I remember when I was in high school, we did a debate on capital punishment, and the big question was, does it deter crime? And so we were supposed to try to demonstrate, in order to prove it right or wrong, does it deter crime? That's the practical side. The problem with that is it doesn't deal with the principle of life, and punishment from a theological standpoint. It doesn't deal with the scriptures. It's only asking the questions, what will happen if we don't do this? I'm not suggesting that you leave the practical consequences out. Those implications are part of the discussion, but that cannot be the tail that wags the dog. Okay, the practical implications of the decision are consequences, but they have to submit to, pun intended, they have to submit to the theological foundation for what. So you guys are right in quoting scripture, and there are scriptures on both sides of the equation that make this challenging. I want to say, Liz, I appreciate your tenacity and you've obviously thought this through, and I've pushed you a little bit. We have pushed you, and I appreciate your stance on that. Whether everybody else comes out on the same page or a different page is something that each one is going to have to. I mean, here's a pastor in the story who's needs time to think this through. Okay, he's a pastor, okay? He's prepared theologically. He lives in this culture. He's not an American missionary that's thinking, oh boy, how do we deal with it? This is his people and his culture. Now, I don't know whether it's a true story or whether it's a made up one because they don't tell us. But
I wanted to know what the conclusion is.
well, they never tell you that.
Oh, that's the worst.
There's a reason why they don't. It's a good reason. So, okay, well, our time's about up, but you guys, this is exactly, I think we set the pace in today's case study for what I want to see us do throughout the semester. You've presented a case, and even those of you who disagreed with her presented your disagreements in a very Christian, loving, respectful manner. That's the way it should be. And and a couple of times you were struggling. I don't know exactly how to say this. That's part of the intention of this format. We have to it's okay to blumble around and say, man, how do I put this in words? You're not failing to do your job when you do that. You're expressing something that should happen in this class. If we can get through all these case studies and everybody be totally articulate with no struggling at all, then maybe we haven't gone deep enough. So this is good. This is very, very good. She did a good job. She sent me the items, the story itself, the main characters. She presented the issues, the alternatives, her view, and spent quite a bit of time explaining that. She gave scripture, which I asked for, passages, and then she gave me her bibliography. So now you can bring it in printed form if you want. She sent it to me by email. I don't care. I've got hers in front of me here. All you need is one copy either way from me, or send it to me by email. So you did a good job. It's a tough subject. There's a lot of disagreement. And another thing, just in closing here, if you're on a field or in a ministry situation where you have colleagues, this type of thing, needs to be discussed. And if there's disagreement on the field, then, you have to consider what kind of mechanism will help us to deal with this, so that this disagreement doesn't divide our field or send some people home or whatever. So this is good practice. Okay, next Tuesday, we do not have a case study because Reverend Bill Jenkins will be here from CBM sharing with us. Thursday is Amy, you're on. So everybody, what's the title of yours?
I can't remember which one I'm
Okay. It's on Canvas. I think I update. By the way, Liz, I did update the syllabus. What had happened was I hadn't updated the PDF. What's the name of it?
Adultery or polygamy.
Adultery or polygamy. All right. Oh, that sounds interesting. So we should read that. And yeah, I got your everybody's cards here. Tell me if you read it or not. You don't need one. I know you do. Thank you.
You would hope that I would have read it before,
We only got 4 cards. There are 5 of you decided, right?
No, I haven't put mine in yet.
Oh, okay. Thank you.